discuss a book published by Pontifex University Press. Could you hold it up?
Sure.
God's Dealings with the Minds of Men, Essays on Biblical Inspiration, Mysticism, and the Imagination by Father Vincent McNabb. So, Matt, great to have you here today. Here we are in the courtyard garden at St. Jerome's Convent.
Good to be here, David. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And we're in very close to Berkeley, California, a place called El Cerrito. You were the editor of this book. So this is a republication of a book that was first published in 1903.
Yes.
Now, first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you discovered the book? So what's your interest? Where are you coming at this from initially in your training, which I think is interesting?
Well, my academic background is in philosophy and theology. I studied at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, just down the road from here, and did my thesis on Dionysius and Aquinas. Anyone who goes to school with the Dominicans does work with Thomas, and so yes. I have that sort of Thomistic background and the interest in Dominicans as well. As far as the material for the book is concerned, I think were you kind of interested in what it was that struck me about the book?
Yes. So first of all, why are you in a position to look at this? So you're now working. Oh, right. What's your current job? And then because I know that you see books pass before your eyes all day. Should we say?
Yes, that's true. So after graduating from the Dominican school, I ended up getting a job first as a combination library assistant and adjunct philosophy professor at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, which is the local diocesan seminary, trains priests for the Archdiocese of San Francisco and a number of other jurisdictions. And eventually I was moved into a full-time position in the library. And so I'm constantly coming across old books that are, maybe collecting dust, some of them deservedly so, others, I think, they're being in need of rediscovery.
Yes.
And so we had come up with this idea of perhaps republishing some books. And at some point, I think I sent you an email with a list of, you and Charlie with an email with a list of titles. I think some of them were books that I'd found in the collection. I come across a lot of old books. And then this one, I can't remember exactly how I found. I believe it was uploaded onto archive.org, and so there was already part of what was determining whether we did this, if I'm remembering correctly, is that a lot of these books already had OCR text recognition manuscripts online, so it was just a matter of taking those manuscripts and making them fit for public consumption, rather than having to say, scan the books ourselves and retype anything like that.
Right. So we probably won't go into what OCR is, but this is what you're saying is that this was readily available. It's something that we know we can republish
readily. It's in public domain. Yes. So it was published in 1903, which means that the copyright on it has expired. I think another aspect of this is that for the reason why we ended up choosing this book, one of the things that led to that particular list of books being the way it was that these were all books that hadn't been republished in handsome editions. And I make that last note just because there are these book republishing services that will just take scans of books and republish them with generic covers and not do anything in addition to that. And I think this book was available online as like a scan or something.
Yes. Yeah.
But our idea was to take this and really retypeset it and include explanatory footnotes and maybe some new prefatory material and make it into some like a book that someone would want to have on his shelf, which I don't think can really be said of those kind of scanned reproduction type releases.
Right. So aside from the production side, you referred to Charlie, my colleague Charlie Dice, who works with me here at Pontifex University Press. And we looked at this, and when you sent a list of possible titles, immediately I saw the name Vincent McNabb. Thought, well, I know
He's a well-known figure, especially by those in the land movement and the distributist movement,
Yes.
which is not something I'm wholly behind, shall we say, but nevertheless there is an interest. This is it's topical. There's a good sort of discussion about this at the moment.
And I should say too that working as I do at a seminary, I have a lot of contact with seminarians, and they're the main patrons for the library. And I was talking about this project or this idea for a project with a couple of them at one point, and mentioned some. I think I mentioned some possible titles, and one of the titles I mentioned, I said, was a book by Vincent McNabb, and one of the seminarians' faces lit up, and he said, "Oh, Vincent McNabb." So I realized at that point that McNabb. I mean, I'd heard of him before, so obviously I knew that he had name recognition in that sense. But like, I realized that he had name recognition in a broader sense. That people like the seminarians at St. Patrick's would just know about him if they saw, or know who the book was by if they saw it on Amazon.
Now, of course, it's one thing to have name recognition for the author. It has to be worth reading as well. I know there's certain things caught my eye, but what was it about the subject matter? Perhaps just summarize what's contained within it, and then just tell us in the broadest terms what caught your eye about it. What made you think it might be of interest to other people today?
Sure. Well, I should mention that in a way, this is a republication of a republication. So it wasn't originally written as one cohesive work. It was originally a series of essays that were published. I think 4 of them in American Ecclesiastical Review, 1 in American Catholic Quarterly, and then another as the foreword to a book on mysticism, if I'm not mistaken, or on anchorites maybe. But I think part of the appeal for me was the fact that it was on a collection of topics that seemed like they would be of perennial and continuing interest to people. So if you look at the titles of the essays, I mean, one is on imagination and faith. Mm-hmm. There's another one, and that's something that is simply talked about a lot, as you noted in your new foreword to the book. That's something that's talked about a lot in Catholic circles, the idea of the Catholic imagination. Vic McNabb has an essay in here on St. Thomas on the creation story in Genesis and how Thomistic principles can be used to reconcile modern science with the creation narrative. He has 2 essays on inspiration and revelation, one focusing on Thomistic principles and another looking at the work of Cardinal Newman, kind of trying to give an evaluation of Newman's work, maybe give it a mild critique in some respects, but also defend him against some of his detractors.
Yes.
And then let's see, the other essays, one is on mysticism, and that's, again, a topic of perennial interest.
Yeah.
And what was the last one? I have the book right here. Scholasticism and the Modern Method. And that one, I think, there's something good about looking at the role of the continued role of scholasticism that scholasticism can play in dialogue with modern thought. And I think actually this wasn't maybe consciously informing me at the time, but there has been kind of a resurgence of scholasticism, an interest in scholasticism and in Thomas Aquinas in recent years. And so the idea that scholasticism would have something to say to people who are interested in modern philosophy, to modern thinkers, there's relevance there.
Yeah.
So it just struck me as a collection of essays, most or all on topics that would be of interest to the average reader.
Yes.
Or at least the average Catholic reader with intellectual interests.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's quite a dense writer. I mean, and I'm extremely grateful to you. I read through it and I was interested in the topics, but you've written quite a lot of explanatory notes explaining the terminology, and of course your background at the Dominican school helped you there. And the things that caught my eye, I should say, one is the reference to the imagination, particularly, and also his description of mysticism, in that we seem to live in an age today where these things are either described in 2 different ways. One, it's almost highly rational, and so things like mysticism are just discounted as delusion in a way. And the other one the other extreme is to feel it, just to think of it in a almost sort of exaggerated New Agey way, just sort of driven by emotion. These things just appear out of the blue or something, without really engaging the natural human faculties, if you want to describe that. And what I loved about his approach is that he is dealing with these terms, but he's not going into either extreme at all. It's a very sober account, and it's even Catholic. So, for example, I come across a lot of people talking about the creativity of artists, and even Catholics who are orthodox and genuinely trying to be creative in the context of the faith will stray towards what I feel is this sort of overly charismatic language. And he really does strike a balance, I think, in that. Now, when we were talking before, you mentioned something that particularly interested you. That's his approach to scriptural analysis.
Yes.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and how he approaches it.
Sure. Oh, well, you mean his understanding of scriptural revelation and inspiration?
Well, that, and also the sort of historical, critical analysis. Yeah.
Well, I think what's surprising and refreshing is his openness. On the one hand, his openness to modern methods of biblical criticism, and on the other hand, his obvious desire to stay true to the deposit of faith. And I think that there's something very attractive, at least for me personally, about that the combination of being willing to take the truth wherever one finds it, while at the same time maintaining a strict fidelity to the truths that have been revealed to us in Catholic doctrine. And I think that seems to be what's kind of informing his approach to questions like the interpretation of Genesis, or I mean, in another context, how he looks at the formation of Scripture. He's very careful to say that on the one hand, we can maybe affirm certain aspects of the documentary hypothesis. On the other hand, we also have to maintain that Scripture is inspired.
Yes.
So I think it's that balance that he strikes that I find refreshing.
Yes, this is something that can be puzzling to non-Catholics. As you were talking, I remember having a conversation with somebody in the philosophy department at UC Berkeley, actually, who thought that there would be a contradiction between being a Catholic and an authentic search for truth. That at some point you'd have to put away your freedom, if you sort of need to discern. But of course, for Catholics, it isn't like that at all. The light of faith, if you like, guides us to what is true. And if anything were shown, or the faith was shown not to be true, if that were possible, it hasn't been, I don't believe it is, but then I would have to accept it. But but what you're saying is correct. There is an authentic search for truth from Catholics, and the faith is just really shining a light on that and helping us to see it. And as you say, it comes through in what Vincent McNabb says.
I can't help but think, without going off into a rabbit hole on this, there's a talk that was given a number of years ago by Russell Hittinger from the University of Tulsa, in which he talks about two different styles of Thomism in the early 20th, I think it was the late 19th and early 20th century, that he connected in some ways, at least loosely, with Leo XIII and Pius X. And he described one, if I'm not remembering correctly, as synthetic Thomism, and the other as legislative Thomism. And I think the idea of legislative Thomism being the use of Thomistic principles to place restrictions on what could and couldn't be studied or asserted propositionally, which became dominant in some ways after in 1907 with the modernist encyclical condemning modernism and with the rise of the modernist crisis. And he saw that as being somewhat in contrast to a kind of the Leonine approach to Thomas, which was to take Thomistic principles and apply them to modern problems in a fruitful dialogue. And I think that that's much more that second category, the synthetic Thomism, is much more characteristic of how McNabb is conducting himself in these essays.
Right, and you made, again, as we were discussing this before we started recording, you made an interesting comment about the fact that his description of the biblical analysis, I think, did you say that this was an essay that perhaps couldn't have been published 20 years later?
Even 10 years later, I think. Just because there was, we said these essays were published, I think, between 1901 and 1902, or 1900 and 1902. The book was published in 1903. 4 years later, Pius X released the encyclical Pascendi, which amounted to a condemnation of what he called modernism. And I think that I'm not an expert on the history of this period, but my understanding is that initiated a period in which there had to be more caution on the part of people who were writing about controversial issues, lest they run afoul of, rightly or wrongly, of the Roman authorities. And I think there's an incident that happened maybe 5 to 7 years after the release of that encyclical with McNabb that I think is telling, both with regard to the changed atmosphere of the times and also with regard to McNabb's attitude toward authority in a positive way. There was an article, I believe it was written for the Tablet by a Jesuit, Father Laddie, I think. And McNabb wrote a response to that article, asking some questions about some possible issues that were raised by it. I believe that the topic was something about the parousia, or like the second coming of Christ. And apparently McNabb received some pushback from Rome for this letter, for whatever the content of the letter was, and wrote essentially another letter to the Tablet within a few months, or maybe within a year later, saying, it's come to my attention that some of the things I said might have been construed as being problematic, or might have been problematic in some way, and I just want to make clear that I retract anything I said that may have could be taken in a sense contrary to the Catholic faith, and I submit myself to the authority of the Holy See. So I think that, like I said, I think that illustrates both that the times were more charged after that point, but that also McNabb himself was willing to go along with the changed circumstances and submit himself to authority when the authority demanded that submission.
Right, but so where would these essays then stand today? That they're not going to be condemned by Rome.
Oh no, I don't think so. I mean, and I should make clear, we put this on the copyright page of the book. These essays, or this book, did get an imprimatur and a nihil obstat, I believe, when it was published. So it wasn't something that was published and then condemned or something like that.
Yes. And actually, it seems to me that we've come, well, not, if not full circle, but we've taken an arc back more into the sort of position that he was taking today. But I'm talking about Orthodox Catholics.
Yes,
are probably going to think more closely to the way McNabb does than those did in 1920 or something like that.
Well, I mean,
it struck me.
I was saying earlier that McNabb's approach is characterized by both fidelity and also openness. And I think that's how people have tended to characterize, for example, Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger's approach to the Gospels in his Jesus of Nazareth books, that he wants to take the best from the historical critical method while at the same time still reading the scriptures in the light of faith. And I think that's very much the spirit that is informing McNabb's approach to scripture as well.
Yes, and of course being open to direction from tradition and the church fathers as well, which is very important.
Well, we'd encourage people to read this book. We could go on. It's available on Amazon.com. And
at a fairly low price, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it's pretty reasonable.
$8.95 or $9.95 or something like
it's
that.
It's pretty good.
Yes.
What there's a couple of interesting things that come out of it. First of all, we were trying to work it out. His the grandnephew, is it? Or Vincent McNabb?
Great nephew.
Great nephew. So in other words, his grandfather's brother was Vincent McNabb.
Great grandfather's brother.
Great grandfather. Okay, there we go. Who is a Catholic and a lay Dominican and writer, got in touch with us and said he was thrilled to see that this book was published, and it was particularly appropriate to his personal interests, particularly on inspiration and mysticism. And so we've asked him whether he would be interested in writing a foreword to the next book that we're thinking of bringing out. What's next, do you think?
I mentioned that I come across a lot of books at the library, and I probably shouldn't say the title at this point, just to kind of keep things under wraps.
Yes.
But I found another McNabb book that, like this one, hadn't been republished in a handsome edition, and actually, from what I can tell, has completely flown under the radar. It's seems like a bit of a lost treasure. It has. I was looking through the table of contents and flipping through some of the essays, and they look. It looks like a real winner. So we're planning to get that out sooner rather than later.
And this is more of a sort of personal reflection, isn't it?
It's a mix.
Yeah. Okay.
It has some of his personal reflections. I think, from what I can tell, some of the stories may even be some of the essays may even be written almost in a kind of story-like fashion.
Okay.
But then he also has essays on St. Thomas. He has an essay on the liturgy that I thought looked particularly interesting.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it seems like a promising next step for our republication of McNabb.
Right. Well, I can't wait to talk to you about that when that comes out, and we'll be able to reveal more details at that time.
Yes.
And so until then, Matt Horwitz, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here. Hey! In the stream. There we go.